Welcome to Book Buzz Reviews and Summaries. We all think we make decisions with reason, logic, and a clear view of reality. We pride ourselves on our ability to weigh the evidence, consider the options, and arrive at conclusions that are fair and well thought out. Yet, time and time again, we make decisions that defy all logic. The promotion we passed up, the business venture we rushed into, the argument we can't seem to win, all decisions that felt right at the time but in hindsight seem utterly wrong. What happened? Where did we go wrong? Chances are, we were under the powerful influence of unconscious biases, hidden forces that shape our thinking, cloud our judgment, and push us toward decisions that are irrational, flawed, and often downright harmful. The most troubling part? We don't even realize it's happening. In You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake, Olivier Sibony reveals a truth most of us would rather ignore. Our brains are wired for shortcuts that prioritize speed over accuracy, emotion over reason, and comfort over truth. From the choices we make at the office to those in our personal lives, our biases distort our decision-making process, often leading us to make terrible mistakes without even realizing it. We may like to think that we are free from these cognitive traps, that our rational minds are untouchable by the subtle manipulations of these biases. But the reality is far more humbling. We are all susceptible, and the stakes are too high to ignore. This book isn't just about uncovering the biases that influence our decisions. It's about learning how to fight them. It's about equipping ourselves with the tools to recognize these invisible forces and counteract their influence. The stakes are high because every decision, big or small, shapes the course of our lives. The way we navigate the pitfalls of bias can determine whether we succeed or stumble, whether we thrive or regret, whether we make our best decisions or our worst mistakes. But the good news is this: bias, though powerful, is not invincible. With awareness, deliberate practice, and a few powerful strategies, we can learn to see the world more clearly, think more rationally, and make decisions that reflect our true potential. As you read these pages, you'll discover why your brain so often leads you astray, and more importantly, how you can take back control. Because in the end, the best decisions are those that are made with the understanding of how our minds can mislead us, and the tools to correct course when we've veered off track. This book is not just a guide to better decision-making. It's an invitation to challenge the very way we think. By understanding how our biases distort our thinking, we open the door to better choices, better outcomes, and a better future. Ready to fight the biases that threaten your judgment? You're about to make a decision that could change everything. Welcome to the fight for better thinking. Welcome to You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake. Introduction: the cost of bias in decision-making. In the introduction, Sibony sets the stage by diving into a simple yet profound question: why do we make such terrible decisions, even when we know better? He starts by pointing out that humans are not always the rational, logical creatures we often imagine ourselves to be. Instead, we are often victims of cognitive biases, systematic patterns of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. These biases distort our perception of reality and lead us to make decisions that can be disastrous. Sibony uses the example of business leaders, executives, and even regular individuals who fall prey to biases that seem invisible at first. For instance, how often do we jump to conclusions or make decisions based on incomplete information? How often do we give in to groupthink or succumb to a status quo bias? These are just a few of the biases that influence our daily choices, and the stakes are high. Chapter 1: the biases we all share. In this chapter, Sibony lays out the foundational idea that no one is immune to biases. This is a humbling realization, especially for decision-makers who believe they are above such influences. He discusses well-known biases such as 1. Confirmation bias, the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already believe, ignoring evidence that contradicts it. 2. Anchoring bias, the human tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we encounter when making decisions. 3. Overconfidence bias, the tendency for individuals to overestimate their abilities or knowledge in a specific area, leading to poor decision-making. Sibony explains how these biases distort our decision-making by influencing what we pay attention to, how we interpret information, and even how we forecast future outcomes. He shares examples from history, business, and everyday life, demonstrating how even the most rational-seeming decisions are often the result of distorted thinking. Chapter 2. The Limits of Human Reasoning. Here, Sibony delves into the limitations of human reasoning, citing studies that show how our brains are hardwired to take shortcuts. These shortcuts, while sometimes useful in everyday life, can lead to flawed decision-making in complex or high-stakes situations. One example Sibony offers is the availability heuristic, a mental shortcut that involves making decisions based on immediate examples that come to mind. The problem, he notes, is that we tend to remember the most dramatic or recent events, even if they're not representative. For instance, someone might avoid flying after hearing about a plane crash, even though air travel is statistically much safer than car travel. This chapter also covers framing bias, where the way a question or situation is presented influences our decision. Sibony urges readers to be aware of the fact that reasoning isn't always as objective or clear-cut as we might believe. By acknowledging the limits of our reasoning, we can take steps to mitigate their impact on our decisions. Chapter 3. The Role of Emotions in Decision-Making. In this chapter, Sibony takes a fascinating detour into the emotional side of decision-making. He explains that our emotions are not just arbitrary feelings, but are deeply tied to our decision-making processes. In fact, emotional responses can cloud judgment and skew decision-making, often without us realizing it. Sibony points to the research of neurologist Antonio Damasio, who found that people with damage to the emotional centers of their brains, such as those who have lost the ability to feel emotions, have difficulty making decisions at all. This finding suggests that emotions play an essential role in helping us make choices, particularly when it comes to weighing the pros and cons of different options. However, emotions can also be irrational and manipulative, especially when they lead to impulsive decisions or snap judgments. A personal story Sibony shares in this chapter is about a CEO who, emotionally driven by a desire to meet quarterly goals, pushed his company into a risky investment that ended up being a disaster. The emotional pull to meet short-term targets led him to ignore the more rational, long-term considerations. Sibony stresses that understanding how emotions influence decisions is crucial for leaders who want to make better, more deliberate choices. Chapter 4. Group Dynamics and Collective Biases. As we move to this chapter, Sibony shifts focus to group decision-making and how collective biases often lead to poor decisions. He discusses how people within groups tend to defer to authority, follow the majority opinion, or align with group norms, often without critically assessing the situation. The famous groupthink phenomenon is explored in depth, where groups of individuals, in an effort to avoid conflict or maintain harmony, make irrational decisions. Sibony also touches on herding behavior, where individuals make decisions based on the actions of others, rather than independent judgment. This is particularly dangerous in high-pressure business environments where leaders may ignore dissenting opinions or avoid difficult conversations to keep the peace. One of the stories Sibony recounts here is the case of NASA's decision to launch the Challenger space shuttle in 1986, despite knowing there were technical issues with the O-rings that could cause catastrophic failure. The decision was influenced by a group consensus that downplayed these risks in favor of maintaining a scheduled launch. The tragedy that followed illustrates the dangers of ignoring critical dissent in group decision-making. Chapter 5. Decision-making under uncertainty. Sibony takes a deep dive into decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. He talks about how humans tend to overestimate their ability to predict future events, often letting biases like optimism bias or hindsight bias color their judgment. He discusses how we are hardwired to avoid uncertainty, often making poor choices to feel more in control, even if those choices aren't the best ones. An interesting idea introduced in this chapter is the dread of uncertainty, which can lead us to make decisions that are suboptimal simply because we want to reduce the unknown. For example, an investor might avoid stocks in volatile markets, even though they offer higher long-term returns, out of a desire to avoid uncertainty. Sibony encourages readers to embrace uncertainty and improve their decision-making by acknowledging that not all variables can be controlled. A better approach, he suggests, is to focus on making decisions that are robust and adaptable, even in uncertain situations. Chapter 6. The Influence of Social Pressure. Sibony expands on the idea of social pressure in this chapter, highlighting how individuals make decisions not just based on their own reasoning but in response to the expectations of others. Whether it's the influence of peers, colleagues, or society at large, social pressure can significantly impact the quality of our decisions. He brings up the concept of conformity bias, which refers to our tendency to adopt the opinions or behaviors of others, often at the cost of our own judgment. Sibony uses the example of corporate boards where decision-making is often swayed by dominant personalities or group norms, leading to consensus-based decisions that aren't necessarily the best. The power of authority figures is another aspect Sibony discusses, emphasizing how people often defer to those in positions of power, even when they should critically evaluate their advice or directives. The chapter concludes with advice on how to guard against social pressures, question assumptions, be willing to dissent, and foster an environment where diverse perspectives are welcomed. Chapter 7. Decision-making tools. What works and what doesn't. Sibony pivots toward practical solutions in Chapter 7, focusing on tools and frameworks that can help mitigate biases in decision-making. He highlights some of the most popular methods, such as decision matrices, cost-benefit analysis, and scenario planning. However, he also cautions that no tool is a cure-all, and these methods can still be influenced by underlying biases. A key recommendation from this chapter is pre-mortem analysis, which involves imagining that a decision has failed and asking what went wrong. This technique helps identify potential pitfalls that might not be obvious when we're focused on the positive aspects of a decision. Sibony explains how companies like the U.S. military and Google have successfully incorporated this practice into their decision-making processes. Ultimately, Sibony argues that the best tool for combating biases is a critical mindset, one that constantly questions assumptions, seeks out diverse viewpoints, and embraces uncertainty. Chapter 8. Building a bias-free decision-making culture. In this chapter focuses on creating a culture of bias awareness within organizations. Sibony explains that while individuals can certainly work to overcome their own biases, organizations need to address systemic biases that affect group decisions. He suggests several strategies for fostering a culture where better decisions can thrive, including 1. Training employees to recognize and address biases in themselves and others. 2. Encouraging diversity of thought and dissenting opinions. 3. Implementing structures for constructive debate and deliberate decision-making processes. Sibony concludes by emphasizing that reducing bias is a long-term endeavor, requiring constant vigilance, practice, and openness to change. Chapter 9. The Danger of Overconfidence. In this chapter, Sibony explores overconfidence bias, one of the most common and dangerous cognitive distortions. Overconfidence, as Sibony points out, can lead people to make decisions with excessive certainty, often ignoring the complexities of the situation or the limitations of their knowledge. Overconfidence isn't just about having too much faith in your own abilities. It's about underestimating risks, overestimating your predictions, and making decisions that don't take into account the full range of possible outcomes. Sibony cites the famous example of the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, where many financial professionals, investors, and even central bankers were overconfident in their assessment of the housing market. They failed to consider the possibility of extreme risks, underestimating the chance of a market crash, which led to disastrous results. He also mentions that overconfidence can affect decision-making in business, where executives might believe that their strategies are foolproof despite contradictory evidence. The key to overcoming overconfidence is to cultivate humility and openness to outside perspectives. Sibony advises decision-makers to question their assumptions, solicit feedback from others, and rigorously test their decisions against reality. The more confident we are in our beliefs, the more cautious we should be. Chapter 10. The Problem with Expertise. Here, Sibony tackles the issue of expert bias, the tendency for experts, or those in positions of authority, to rely too heavily on their expertise while neglecting to question their own assumptions or consider alternative viewpoints. Experts can be especially susceptible to biases, as their knowledge can give them a false sense of certainty or cause them to dismiss non-expert input. He points to industries like medicine and finance, where experts can sometimes overlook critical details or refuse to acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge. One example Sibony gives is the case of Doctolib, a healthcare startup in France. The company's doctors, while highly knowledgeable in their fields, overlooked a critical flaw in their platform's design due to their confidence in their expertise. This oversight led to user dissatisfaction and technical issues. Sibony's point is not that expertise is inherently flawed, but rather that we need to balance expertise with skepticism. Experts should be encouraged to collaborate with non-experts, to view problems from different angles, and to remain humble about their knowledge. Sibony advocates for creating environments where even experts are willing to admit their limitations and learn from others, helping to avoid the pitfalls of over-reliance on narrow expertise. Chapter 11. Why we can't ignore diversity. In this chapter, Sibony focuses on the importance of diversity in decision-making, specifically how diverse teams are less prone to biases and more likely to make better decisions. Sibony outlines how cognitive diversity, diversity of perspective, experience, and thought, plays a crucial role in challenging groupthink and ensuring a more thorough examination of all possibilities. Sibony emphasizes that homogeneous groups are more susceptible to biases like groupthink and confirmation bias because they tend to think alike and reinforce each other's biases. On the other hand, diverse teams bring a broader range of experiences and ideas to the table, making them more likely to identify and correct errors in thinking before decisions are made. He cites several studies showing that diverse teams outperform homogeneous ones in solving complex problems, particularly in situations where the answers are not immediately obvious. For example, diverse hiring practices at companies like Google and Apple have been shown to improve creativity and decision-making by ensuring that different viewpoints are represented and considered. Sibony also explores intersectionality and diversity, the idea that diversity isn't just about gender or ethnicity, but also about integrating people with different experiences, educational backgrounds, and even ways of thinking. He stresses that fostering diversity of thought is critical to decision-making, as it leads to more robust, creative, and effective solutions. The diversity of thought allows teams to break out of echo chambers and avoid the biases that often come with homogeneous thinking. Chapter 12. The Power of Disagreement. This chapter revolves around the value of disagreement in decision-making. Sibony explains that while we often think of disagreement as something to avoid, it is in fact crucial for improving the quality of decisions. Disagreement forces us to test our assumptions, reconsider our positions, and explore different angles that we might not have considered on our own. Sibony introduces the concept of constructive conflict, a form of disagreement that is respectful, collaborative, and focused on finding the best solution. He argues that disagreement in decision-making is healthy and should be actively encouraged. It helps prevent groupthink, where everyone agrees to avoid conflict, and confirmation bias, where everyone looks for evidence that supports the same view. An example he uses is the case of the Challenger space shuttle disaster, where engineers and managers were not open to constructive disagreement. Those who had concerns about the O-rings were silenced, and the decision to launch was made despite the potential risks. Sibony contrasts this with the culture at companies like Pixar, which actively promotes disagreement in a structured and productive way, ultimately leading to better outcomes. Sibony offers strategies for fostering a culture of constructive conflict, such as creating environments where disagreement is safe, rewarding people for challenging assumptions, and ensuring that every voice is heard. He stresses that leaders should not only tolerate disagreement, but actively seek it out in order to improve decision-making processes. Chapter 13. When We're Too Close to the Problem. In this chapter, Sibony addresses the issue of proximity bias, which occurs when decision-makers become too close to the problem at hand and lose the ability to make an objective decision. This happens when we are overly involved in a situation, project, or company, leading us to make decisions based on emotion, loyalty, or ingrained assumptions rather than facts. He explains that proximity bias can affect both individuals and teams. For instance, a company might stick with a failing strategy simply because they've invested so much time and money in it, or an employee might avoid acknowledging their own mistakes because they are too emotionally attached to the project. Sibony argues that distance is key for effective decision-making. The further removed you are from the situation, the more likely you are to see it objectively and make decisions based on facts, not emotions. One solution Sibony suggests is the use of external consultants or third-party perspectives, which can offer a fresh take on a problem without the emotional baggage of internal stakeholders. He also advises decision-makers to take a step back, literally and figuratively, when facing critical decisions. This could mean taking time off to reflect or involving people who are not as emotionally invested in the decision. By stepping back from the problem, we can reduce the emotional weight that influences our choices, making our decisions more rational and objective. Chapter 14. Decision-Making in the Real World. In this chapter, Sibony shifts his focus to real-world applications of the principles he's discussed so far. He illustrates how biases and decision-making flaws show up in various industries, from politics to finance to medicine. He also looks at organizations that have attempted to implement solutions to fight bias, offering practical advice on how organizations can structure their decision-making processes to minimize bias. He discusses how structured decision-making tools, like decision-making grids and checklists, can help remove biases from the process. These tools force individuals and teams to think through decisions systematically and thoroughly, ensuring that all potential outcomes are considered and weighed. Sibony also talks about the role of decision-making committees, where decisions are made collectively, and how these committees can create checks and balances to guard against bias. Sibony emphasizes that overcoming biases is not a one-time fix, but requires continual effort, vigilance, and a commitment to improving decision-making over time. He provides examples of companies that have seen tangible benefits by addressing biases in their decision-making processes, showing that these efforts can lead to both better decisions and better outcomes in the long run. Conclusion: the path forward. In his conclusion, Sibony reiterates that while biases are inevitable, they are not insurmountable. The first step to better decision-making is awareness, recognizing that we are all vulnerable to biases and that they can influence every aspect of our lives. He reminds readers that the key to reducing the impact of biases is humility, openness, and vigilance. Sibony calls on individuals and organizations to actively work towards creating environments that value critical thinking, diverse perspectives, and constructive disagreement. He closes by stressing that making better decisions isn't about eliminating all errors. It's about learning to make fewer mistakes and improving the quality of our judgments over time. Final thoughts. You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake offers a fascinating and accessible exploration of the biases that shape our decisions, along with practical strategies for combating them. Through engaging storytelling, research-backed insights, and actionable advice, Sibony empowers readers to become more mindful, critical decision-makers in a world full of cognitive traps. Whether you're an executive, a student, or just an individual trying to improve your personal choices, this book provides valuable tools for navigating the complex landscape of human judgment. Read the book to learn more. If you are liking this series, please subscribe and press the like button. Thank you.